In the quiet town of 1847 Salem, whispers spoke of a man cloaked in piety, a reverend whose sermons were said to heal hearts and souls. But behind the polished pulpit and measured cadence lay a darkness no scripture could illuminate. One family, bound by faith, secrecy, and fear, became the stage for a scandal so unspeakable that the town tried desperately to erase it from memory. He called it divine providence. The world called it monstrous. A daughter, barely 16, became both worshipper and victim, a pawn in a perverse conviction that God's will could justify any act, no matter how taboo. The Reverend's twisted devotion would shock a nation, challenge morality, and leave a legacy of whispers, guilt, and horror that lingered for decades. This is the story of a faith corrupted, a family destroyed, and a town forced to reckon with the unthinkable. In 1847, Reverend Jonathan Whitmore was the embodiment of devout virtue in Salem. His tall frame, crisp black coat, and silver-edged spectacles lent him an air of authority that commanded respect. Parishioners spoke of his eloquence from the pulpit, his voice capable of stirring the soul and calming the troubled mind. Children adored him, adults revered him, and the town council often sought his counsel on matters of morality and law. To outsiders, he was the perfect embodiment of divine providence, a man seemingly chosen to shepherd the faithful. Yet those closest to him whispered differently. His household, modest yet meticulously maintained, carried a subtle tension that outsiders could not perceive. Reverend Whitmore's wife, Martha, a quiet woman with eyes perpetually cast downward, seemed to exist only to maintain the outward appearance of domestic normalcy. Their daughter, Abigail, was strikingly intelligent, reserved, and obedient, the kind of child every parent hoped to raise. But Abigail's compliance was forced, cultivated under a strict regime of faith and fear. Within the parlor, the Reverend spent hours discussing Scripture with Abigail, guiding her study in ways that went beyond typical religious instruction. His attention, intense and unwavering, bordered on obsession. Visitors occasionally noticed Abigail's pale complexion, the nervous flutter in her hands, the way her eyes darted anxiously when her father entered the room. To the Reverend, however, it was merely the refinement of a soul being prepared for divine purpose. Town gossip was muted. Reverend Whitmore's reputation provided him a shield. Mothers and fathers brought their children to him for guidance, trusting in his moral authority, while Abigail's suffering remained hidden behind closed doors. It was a home ruled by sermons and scripture, yet beneath the sanctified veneer, control had become devotion twisted into something unrecognizable, a dangerous intersection of faith and obsession. By all outward appearances, Reverend Jonathan Whitmore was Salem's moral compass. But within the confines of his own home, a line had already been crossed, setting the stage for an act so unthinkable that the town, and the nation, would struggle to comprehend it. Abigail Whitmore grew up under the weight of her father's unwavering scrutiny. Her earliest memories were a mixture of candlelight, scripture, and the constant sense that her every thought was observed. Reverend Jonathan Whitmore framed his attention as guidance, claiming it was divine intervention that had placed Abigail in his care, shaping her into a vessel of God's will. But behind the veneer of religious instruction, there was a sinister undercurrent, a manipulation of devotion into submission, and obedience into a disturbing form of control. Abigail's childhood was isolated. Playmates were discouraged, friendships closely monitored, and the world beyond the Whitmore parlor presented as dangerous, sinful, or corrupt. The Reverend instructed her in theology and morality with painstaking precision, yet his lessons often blurred the lines between piety and power. He would quote scripture with unwavering certainty, interpreting passages in ways that justified behavior that no reasonable mind could accept. Divine providence guides the faithful, he told her repeatedly, and you, Abigail, are chosen to fulfill God's plan. Over the years, Abigail's adolescence was marked by fear and confusion. While other girls in Salem experienced childhood innocence, Abigail's days were filled with relentless lessons, choreographed routines, and constant supervision. Her mother, Martha, offered little resistance, too enmeshed in social propriety and silent complicity to intervene. Abigail internalized her father's commands, seeing them as sacred duty, a sacred weight she could not question. Visitors occasionally noticed the unnatural formality of her behavior, her hesitant glances, her whispered responses, the almost imperceptible tremor when her father entered the room. Some suspected the Reverend's attentions were excessive, yet few dared speak. His reputation provided a shield, his sermons commanded loyalty, and the community's trust in his piety left Abigail suffering invisible. By the time she reached 16, Abigail was a young woman of sharp intellect and remarkable restraint, yet entirely molded by her father's doctrine. The town saw only his careful guidance and moral tutelage, blind to the psychological and spiritual imprisonment that had shaped her into a silent, obedient figure. It was in this isolation, this blending of faith and coercion, that Abigail became not only a daughter but a pawn, destined for a fate that her father would later claim as divine providence, yet history would forever recognize as unthinkable. By the spring of 1863, Reverend Jonathan Whitmore's sermons had grown more fervent, and his fascination with his daughter's piety reached a new, unspoken intensity. Abigail, now 16, carried herself with quiet composure, her intellect sharpened by years of isolation and instruction. To outsiders, she was the perfect model of virtue, obedient, reverent, and devoted to God. Yet within the walls of the Whitmore parlor, a far darker ideology had taken root. The Reverend began to speak of divine providence not merely as guidance, but as an active force dictating events and actions beyond human understanding. In private, he told Abigail that God had chosen their family for a special purpose, one that required them to transcend societal norms and human judgment. He framed every lesson, every command, and eventually, every illicit act as a sacred duty. "Providence moves through us," he whispered, his voice cold yet reverent. "It is not our place to question, only to obey." Abigail's mind, molded by years of unwavering obedience, struggled to reconcile these teachings with the natural instincts she had suppressed. Faith, reverence, and indoctrination intertwined, blurring the line between moral duty and coercion. She began to internalize her father's worldview, that the union, forbidden by law and by custom, was ordained by a higher power. Every moment of doubt was met with scripture, every flicker of resistance quelled by the weight of his conviction. Outside observers noted nothing amiss. The Reverend's sermons were fiery, uplifting, and seemingly righteous, earning him admiration throughout Salem. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose moral authority was unchallenged. Abigail's compliance appeared natural to neighbors, a product of careful upbringing and strict discipline. None suspected that the same household, which outwardly embodied virtue, harbored a secret so abhorrent it would scandalize a nation. Eleanor's era of strict morality, cloaked in God's name, was now replaced by something far darker, a doctrine where human law held no sway, and divine providence justified acts that even the most fervent believer would recoil from. Abigail, educated, obedient, and isolated, was trapped within a theology perverted to serve her father's desires. In the Whitmore household, faith had become a weapon, devotion a chain, and divine providence a justification for a sin so profound that history would struggle to comprehend it. Abigail's fate had been sealed, and the town, blind to the horror unfolding in their midst, remained entirely unaware. Even in the tightly knit town of Salem, rumors have a way of spreading, like wildfire carried by the gentlest breeze. By 1864, murmurs began to ripple through the congregation of Reverend Whitmore's church. Parishioners spoke in hushed tones about the unusual closeness between Abigail and her father, noting glances, gestures, and behaviors that unsettled even the most faithful. Yet fear of social reprisal, coupled with the Reverend's imposing reputation, kept most from voicing suspicion openly. Families who had once sought Jonathan Whitmore's counsel now hesitated at the church doors, exchanging furtive glances that spoke of unarticulated unease. Some whispered that Abigail had grown too quiet, too composed, and that there was something unnatural in her manner, something almost rehearsed. Mothers warned their daughters to maintain distance, while older women shook their heads, recalling veiled warnings from the Reverend himself about questioning God's plan. The whispers were subtle, but they carried an unmistakable charge of faith. Despite these murmurs, no one dared confront the Reverend directly. His sermons remained powerful, his influence unquestioned, and his moral authority insulated him from scrutiny. To challenge him was to risk not only social ostracism but the deeply ingrained belief that he acted under divine guidance. Abigail's silence, meticulously cultivated under years of instruction, reinforced this illusion. Outsiders saw piety. Only those paying close attention noticed the tension that never fully dissipated, the way she flinched at sudden movement, or the involuntary tremor of her hand when she entered the pulpit beside him. In private, Abigail began to sense the growing awareness of others, the hushed conversations and quick, sidelong glances. She felt both fear and resignation, recognizing the walls closing in. Her father, meanwhile, framed any suggestion of impropriety as weakness of faith, reinforcing that only through obedience could they fulfill God's plan. He wielded Providence like a blade, cutting away doubt, shaping his daughter's perception until the line between devotion and coercion was imperceptible. The tension within the congregation escalated subtly. Elders, wary but silent, whispered prayers for Abigail and her family. Children sensed unease and avoided lingering near the pulpit. Yet, for the Reverend, every whisper was confirmation. Providence had placed him at the center of a sacred, if incomprehensible, design, and his household alone understood its demands. The town's whispers were growing, but fear and faith combined to maintain a fragile silence. Abigail's world, already constrained by doctrine and isolation, was becoming ever more claustrophobic, and the Reverend's interpretation of divine will was approaching its most horrifying manifestation. The Reverend's sermons had long framed obedience to divine will as the highest form of virtue, but by 1865, he began to act on the ideology he had carefully cultivated in Abigail. He spoke of providence not as guidance alone, but as a force demanding action, a sacred mandate to transcend the bounds of law and morality in the service of God. In the quiet hours of the parlor, he explained to Abigail that their family had been chosen to fulfill a purpose so exalted that earthly judgment could not comprehend it. Abigail, molded by years of strict instruction, had internalized the principle that dissent was sin, and obedience was salvation. Her adolescence had been defined by isolation, ritual, and unyielding discipline, leaving her unable to distinguish between paternal care and coercion. The Reverend's words, now direct commands, carried the weight of Scripture itself. He framed his desires as divine necessity, as though God's own hand guided the most intimate aspects of their lives. The first act of providence, as he called it, was subtle yet deliberate. He orchestrated private moments under the guise of instruction, long hours in study, prayer, and contemplation, always emphasizing that their actions were sanctified and that Abigail's compliance would honor God's will. Fear and faith intertwined. She obeyed not only out of terror but because the foundation of her understanding was inseparable from his ideology. Every refusal she might have considered was replaced with a sense of sacred duty. Outside the home, the town remained largely unaware. The Reverend standing in the community insulated him from suspicion. Abigail's outward composure masked the internal turmoil, and the household appeared to outsiders as a model of piety. Even as whispers of impropriety circulated in hushed tones among the congregation, no evidence existed, and none dared confront a man so deeply revered. Yet within the Whitmore household, the air thickened with the weight of secrecy and anticipation. Abigail began to realize that providence, as defined by her father, was absolute, and that resistance was both unthinkable and perilous. The private rituals of obedience, once abstract, had become immediate, tangible, and terrifyingly real. This first act of so-called divine providence marked a turning point. Abigail's life, carefully shaped by devotion, fear, and isolation, would now become inseparable from her father's interpretation of God's will, an interpretation that history would later recognize as horrifying, incomprehensible, and criminal. By 1866, the once quiet whispers in Salem had begun to harden into suspicion. Elders in the congregation exchanged glances laced with unease. Mothers cautioned daughters about lingering too long near the Reverend's parlor. Rumors, once dismissed as idle gossip, began to carry weight. The community sensed a moral transgression, though the details remained obscured by fear, piety, and reverence for the Reverend's authority. Reports of Abigail's unusual behavior, her silence in public, her visible tension around her father, and her unusual withdrawal from social gatherings, fueled speculation. Some villages hinted at impropriety, while others cautiously suggested that the Reverend's obsession with divine providence might have twisted his family in ways that defied reason. Few dared speak openly, fearing the social and spiritual consequences of accusing a man held in such high esteem. Eleanor and others, longtime family friends, were torn between loyalty and suspicion. Letters arrived from concerned relatives, urging intervention, but the Reverend framed these efforts as tests of faith, claiming that providence demanded the family remain steadfast. Abigail herself, trained to obedience, offered no complaint, and the veneer of propriety remained intact for outsiders. Despite these constraints, a subtle fracture formed within the town. Certain families began to avoid church services, questioning sermons that praised Providence while ignoring human decency. Some parishioners discreetly investigated the Whitmore household, attempting to glean evidence without confrontation. They noticed peculiar schedules, closed curtains, and Abigail's increasingly haunted eyes, a silent testament to a life controlled by fear and doctrinal manipulation. The Reverend remained outwardly unshaken. He used sermons to reinforce the narrative. Providence was absolute, God's plan unquestionable, and the family's obedience a model of righteousness. Yet beneath the polished public persona, a tension simmered. The town's unease, though not fully articulated, threatened the isolation he relied upon to maintain control. Eleanor, observing from the periphery, documented the growing dissonance between public admiration and private suspicion. She recognized that the Reverend's influence, though formidable, had limits, and that the facade of divinely justified authority could not withstand persistent scrutiny forever. The stage was set for confrontation. Salem, long complicit in silence, was beginning to tang, and Abigail's captivity under her father's warped sense of providence could not remain hidden. The reckoning, when it came, would be as inevitable as it was horrifying. The breaking point came in late 1867, when a visiting relative, unfamiliar with the Whitmore household's strict routines, arrived unexpectedly. The visitor, a distant aunt from Boston, noticed Abigail's pallor, her furtive glances, and the oppressive atmosphere that hung in the parlor. Questions, initially casual, escalated into pointed inquiries about Abigail's well-being and the Reverend's constant supervision. Abigail's mother, Martha, remained silent, caught between fear and complicity, while the Reverend's usual calm veneer began to crack. He attempted to assert authority through scripture and sermons on divine duty, but the relative's persistence exposed cracks in the carefully maintained illusion. Observations that had been whispered in shadows now became documented accounts, letters sent to concerned neighbors and church members. The once invisible horrors of the Whitmore home were suddenly visible, undeniable, and morally repugnant. The town reacted with shock and disbelief. Parishioners who had long revered the Reverend struggled to reconcile the image of a moral leader with the accusations that now surfaced. Abigail, once the epitome of obedience, was revealed as both victim and witness, her quiet suffering a stark counterpoint to her father's public persona. As evidence accumulated, the clergy and local authorities were compelled to intervene, forced to confront the truth that had festered in silence for nearly 2 decades. Public outrage spread quickly. Congregation members felt betrayed, families recoiled, and whispers transformed into urgent calls for justice. Editorials in local papers condemned the Reverend's actions, framing them not as misguided devotion but as a criminal violation of societal and divine law alike. Salem, a town built on moral rigor and religious observance, found itself confronting an atrocity within its own walls, one that challenged both faith and civic duty. Abigail, though traumatized, began to tell her story. Her words, previously stifled by fear and conditioning, now carried the weight of survival. She described years of isolation, manipulation, and coercion, and how her father had framed acts of abuse as divine mandate. The townspeople listened in horror, recognizing the calculated nature of the Reverend's control and the extensive psychological torment inflicted upon his daughter. The discovery shattered the Whitmore household, revealing a corruption of faith so profound that it stunned an entire community. Reverend Jonathan Whitmore, once a symbol of divine providence, was now exposed as a man who had twisted morality to serve his own dark desires, leaving a town to grapple with the unthinkable. The trial of Reverend Jonathan Whitmore commenced in the spring of 1868, drawing the attention of Salem and neighboring towns alike. The courtroom was filled to capacity, a mixture of clergy, curious townspeople, and journalists eager to witness the proceedings. Outside, whispers and speculations surged through the streets. The once revered minister had become the subject of national scandal, his piety replaced by accusations so heinous they seemed almost unbelievable. Abigail testified first, her voice trembling yet resolute. She recounted years of isolation, indoctrination, and coercion under her father's pretense of divine providence. Every word painted a picture of manipulation so meticulous that it had escaped the notice of the town for decades. She described the private sermons, the lessons twisted to justify transgression, and the fear that had governed her adolescence. The courtroom listened in stunned silence, some faces pale with disbelief, others rigid with moral indignation. Witnesses corroborated Abigail's account. Parishioners spoke of unusual behaviors, whispered warnings, and moments of discomfort previously dismissed or ignored. Letters from distant relatives detailed concerns that had been dismissed as exaggeration, evidence of a household carefully shielded by reputation and authority. Even former members of the congregation testified that the Reverend's sermons had increasingly blurred the lines between morality and obsession, although none had anticipated the depth of abuse that lay behind closed doors. The prosecution presented meticulous documentation, including Abigail's journals, letters, and the statements of witnesses who had observed the family over the years. The defense attempted to frame the acts as a misinterpretation of Providence, claiming that Jonathan Whitmore's intentions were spiritual rather than malicious. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. The court could not reconcile his actions with any moral or legal framework, nor could they ignore the psychological and emotional damage inflicted upon his daughter. Public reaction outside the courtroom was swift. Salem streets were abuzz with moral outrage. Editorials condemned the Reverend as a corrupt figure, a warning against blind faith and unchecked authority. The trial became a focal point for debates on morality, parental power, and the dangers of doctrinal extremism. Ultimately, the court found Reverend Jonathan Whitmore guilty. His conviction was both a legal and symbolic condemnation, an acknowledgement that devotion, when perverted, could become the instrument of profound abuse. Abigail, though scarred, had survived, and her testimony ensured that her father's actions would be remembered not as divine providence, but as a cautionary tale of corrupted faith and human betrayal. The conviction of Reverend Jonathan Whitmore marked a turning point for Salem, yet it did not immediately heal the wounds inflicted upon the community or his daughter. The town had faced an unsettling truth. A man who preached divine providence had violated the very moral and spiritual foundations he claimed to uphold. Families were left questioning whom to trust, and the once comforting authority of the clergy had been irreparably shaken. Abigail Whitmore emerged from the trial as both survivor and symbol. Though physically unharmed, her spirit bore the invisible scars of years of manipulation, fear, and psychological torment. She withdrew from public life, seeking refuge in quiet study and private reflection. Her education, once molded by her father's twisted ideology, became a tool for reclaiming autonomy. Slowly, she began to assert her own voice, writing letters and journals to document her experiences, ensuring that the horrors inflicted upon her could not be buried by time or denial. Martha Whitmore, the Reverend's wife, faced a different kind of reckoning. Her complicity, whether born of fear, resignation, or denial, became a subject of both public scrutiny and private shame. The town struggled to reconcile her silence with the reverence once afforded her as a matron of faith. Some expressed sympathy, claiming she had been trapped by her husband's authority. Others condemned her, insisting that she had turned a blind eye to unspeakable acts. The church itself reeled. Congregation attendance declined sharply as families sought alternative places of worship, wary of entrusting their faith to institutions vulnerable to corruption. The scandal prompted discussions throughout Salem and neighboring towns, debates that extended into letters, newspapers, and sermons warning against blind obedience. Reverend Whitmore's actions became a cautionary tale, not only for parents and clergy but for communities that relied unquestioningly on spiritual authority. In the quiet aftermath, Abigail worked to rebuild a life unshaped by her father's doctrine. Her writing, correspondence, and education became tools of resilience. She remained cautious of those who sought to control or exploit her, acutely aware that the world, while free of her father's immediate influence, still contained subtle forms of power and coercion. Ashamed, silenced, yet unbroken, Abigail's survival was a testament to endurance in the face of corruption masquerading as divine providence. Salem would remember the scandal, but in the quiet of her private life, she bore witness to the horrors of a house and a household corrupted, and to the strength required to reclaim one's soul from the grip of fanaticism. The Reverend Jonathan Whitmore's name lingered long after his imprisonment, a shadow that fell over Salem for decades. Even after his death in prison, whispers of his crimes haunted the town, a reminder that devotion, when warped, could produce unspeakable acts. His legacy was not one of sermons or piety, but of moral corruption cloaked in sanctity, a cautionary tale for generations to come. Abigail Whitmore, though she survived, could not escape the imprint of her father's doctrine. Yet she transformed her suffering into resilience. She dedicated herself to education, correspondence, and reflection, determined to reclaim autonomy over the life that had been meticulously controlled and exploited. Friends and distant relatives supported her in quiet ways, offering guidance and protection, though she remained deeply wary of authority. Through letters and memoirs, Abigail ensured her story would endure, a testament not only to her own survival but also to the necessity of vigilance against fanaticism disguised as Providence. The Whitmore scandal became a subject of moral discourse in Salem and beyond. Clergy spoke cautiously of it in hushed sermons, framing the Reverend's actions as a warning against unquestioning obedience. Educators and parents cited it as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the importance of nurturing children with care, autonomy, and reason rather than fear. Even local newspapers chronicled the story intermittently, ensuring that the tale of corrupted faith and paternal manipulation remained part of the region's collective memory. Over time, the town itself shifted. Salem's institutions slowly rebuilt credibility, instilling safeguards to prevent a recurrence of such abuse. Families remained vigilant, but the scars of mistrust and caution lingered. Reverend Whitmore's name became synonymous with perversion of religious authority, a symbol of how power could be manipulated under the guise of divine will. Yet, beyond public memory, the private, enduring impact on Abigail was undeniable. She lived her remaining years carefully, mindful of her autonomy and wary of those who would claim authority over her body or spirit. In her letters and journals, she reflected on survival, the fragility of trust, and the importance of discerning true morality from the perversions of those who exploit belief. In the end, the Whitmore legacy endured as both warning and record, a story of human cruelty justified by twisted faith, a tale of a daughter's resilience in reclaiming her life, and a chilling reminder that even the most revered figures can hide monstrous truths beneath the mask of divinity. By the late 1870s, Salem had begun to confront the lasting impact of the Whitmore scandal, though the process was slow and uneven. The town's once unquestioned faith in its spiritual leaders had been shaken, leaving parishioners wary of the pulpit and suspicious of authority. Families who had once entrusted their children to the Reverend's guidance now questioned the structures of power, morality, and religious oversight that had allowed such horrors to persist unnoticed. Abigail Whitmore, now in her 20s, became an unexpected agent of this reckoning. Though she remained private, her correspondence and memoirs circulated quietly among trusted scholars, clergy, and moral reformers. Her writings chronicled the years of manipulation, isolation, and abuse she had endured, detailing how her father had used scripture to justify acts that defied both law and conscience. In these accounts, she emphasized not vengeance, but understanding, a call to vigilance, compassion, and the recognition of human vulnerability in the face of unchecked authority. The town itself undertook subtle reforms. Church councils implemented oversight for clergy, emphasizing accountability alongside faith. Parents became more actively involved in their children's moral and spiritual education, ensuring that devotion did not become coercion. Even decades later, the Whitmore case served as a touchstone for discussions about power, faith, and the ethical obligations of religious leaders. Yet shadows lingered. Conversations in the town square, in private parlors, and within families often returned to the story of Abigail and her father. The fear, fascination, and moral ambiguity surrounding the Reverend's actions had become part of Salem's collective consciousness, a warning that the veneer of piety could conceal profound corruption. Children grew up hearing fragments of the tale, learning early that trust must be measured, and that authority, no matter how revered, required scrutiny. Abigail herself continued her quiet life, ever mindful of the scars left by her father's actions. She never married, never allowed herself to be dominated again, and carefully cultivated autonomy and intellect. Her survival became a testament to resilience, endurance, and the capacity of one human being to reclaim agency after years of manipulation. In the end, Salem's reckoning was both public and private. The town had learned a painful lesson about faith, authority, and vigilance, while Abigail Whitmore's life stood as proof that even in the shadow of unspeakable horror, the human spirit can endure. The Reverend's crimes would never be forgotten, and the story of a father who claimed divine providence would forever haunt the memory of the town he had betrayed.